On this Sunday night from Washington, D.C., the final push in high-stakes elections. The razor-thin races that could shift the balance of power.
But the power of America is in your hands.
The Democrats' warnings about democracy, plus why what happens in these midterms matters to Canada.
When we fight, we will win!
Plus, access to abortion in America.
I'm going to pay for it because it's unconscionable.
Doctors going to extraordinary lengths to preserve reproductive rights. A record-breaking report heating up the start of the UN Climate Change Summit. And energy terrorism. Russia accused of trying to freeze Ukraine into submission.
This could lead to cities going dark in Ukraine.
The bitter cold warning as winter approaches.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
I look at America reasserting itself around the world to lead the world in the 21st century. There is no quit in America. We just have to remember who we are. We are the United States of America.
If you support the decline and fall of America, then you must vote for the radical left Democrats.
The kind of slash and burn politics that we're seeing right now, that doesn't have to be who we are. It's about fundamental values, values I grew up with, values you grew up with, values we try to teach our kids, values we learn in churches and mosques and synagogues and temples: honesty, fairness, opportunity, hard work.
A sitting president and two former presidents making impassioned appeals to Americans just 2 days ahead of a crucial vote. Good evening and thanks for joining us. We are in Washington, D.C. tonight ahead of a big political moment in this country. Americans are voting in midterm elections this week. 250 million people are eligible to cast a ballot. The results will determine the makeup of the U.S. Congress and set the tone for the next 2 years of President Joe Biden's presidency. Biden's name is not on the ballot, but his party's vision for America is. Biden's approval rating has sunk since he got elected. It now sits at about 44%, depending on which poll you look at. That is not unusual. A president's approval rating often drops after 2 years in office, but historically, that translates into a loss of seats in Congress. And right now, the Democrats can't afford to lose any. Here's the situation. Democrats control both the House of Representatives and the Senate, but by narrow margins. Republicans can retake the House by flipping just 5 seats, and in the Senate, they need to flip just 1 seat to gain control and take the gavel away from Nancy Pelosi. With me is Jackson Proskow, our Washington Bureau Chief. Jackson, Democrats say that democracy is on the ballot in this election. The Republicans say it's all about the economy. Where are things headed on Tuesday?
I don't think anybody knows at this point, and that is what is so remarkable. As you mentioned, this should be a cakewalk for the party not in power, in this case, Republicans. But it's not. Those messages about the fate of democracy, Donald Trump's continued presence in the race, all those things have really been dragging down Republicans at a time when the wind should be blowing in their favor because of Biden's unpopularity and what's going on with the economy and inflation right now. So expect a lot of surprises, both in congressional races, in gubernatorial races. Also, I think, expect that we may not necessarily know, of course, the winners of some of those races for quite some time. So really, Donna, you get the picture, you get the sense that anyone making predictions right now is going out on a limb because it's very, very hard to know how this is going to shake down on Tuesday.
And Jackson, there are lots of Republicans running for office who we know are repeating the lie that the presidential election in 2020 was stolen. There are concerns some of the candidates might not accept the results of this election. Yeah,
that is a very realistic concern here. What's been interesting sort of over the past few weeks is how many of these Republicans have tried to back away from Trump's lie about the 2020 election. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to be seen as looking in the rear view mirror. But in reality, it's a big part of their campaign. And I don't think we know who's going to accept the results and who's going to contest them until we get to that point. But we should point out that former President Trump and his legal team are already talking about how they might contest some of these races, specifically in Pennsylvania, because they see that as a trial run for what they might do in 2024.
Okay, the midterms are on Tuesday, but we know that there was lots of early voting, lots of mail-in ballots. When are we going to know the results?
Yeah, 40 million Americans have already voted in early voting. The problem, though, is that many of these states, like Pennsylvania, do not allow the early processing of those mail-in ballots. So that slows things down. Expect sort of a repeat of 2020 where we're waiting days, maybe even weeks for results. And in the Senate, in Georgia in particular, that race is so close we could be back in a situation where it's a runoff in December. And that may actually decide control of the Senate, so we might be waiting for quite some time here.
All right, Jackson Proskow, thanks. We will come back to you in the days ahead. Thanks. Well, Canadians always watch our neighbor closely, of course, and if these midterms result in the Democrats losing control of the House and the Senate, there will almost certainly be an impact on Canada's relationship with the U.S. Our chief political correspondent, David Akin, is in Canada's capital tonight. David.
Well, Donna, U.S. elections are always a big deal to America's northern neighbor, but this one, it may be especially important.
Lots of things that would be good for Canada if the Congress can become a bit more functional.
The biggest concern for Canada will be to protect its trading relationship with the U.S. and push back on any protectionist tendencies from new members of Congress. And that protectionist push is as likely to come from rookie Democrats as it is rookie Republicans.
Canada is going to have to engage in diplomacy, and that's the private sector and the public sector and civil society, with the new Congress, with the new power players, to explain why Canada is relevant to the United States.
I think it's actually a huge opportunity for Canada. Something that we can't forget is that the U.S. has really stalled making a generational transition in government.
And that shift could move influence away from 80-year-old Mitch McConnell, 82-year-old Nancy Pelosi, 79-year-old Joe Biden, to leaders in their 30s and 40s.
What many of us have been hoping for is for a younger generation to come into leadership, and they will in this Congress.
If, in fact, a Republican-tinged Congress emerges, there will be concerns about the U.S. watering down support for Ukraine. That's according to Canadian David Frum, who once worked in the George W. Bush White House.
The Republicans will bring with them an important minority, especially in the House, that is opposed to supporting Ukraine in its fight for independence against Russia.
And then there's climate change. It would be almost impossible for Canada to impose new rules to cut greenhouse gas emissions on domestic industries, think emission reduction requirements for cars, for example, if the United States was not doing the same.
That doesn't mean Republicans don't care about climate. It just means they have a different way of thinking about incentives and disincentives and that sort of thing.
When Donald Trump was president, the Trudeau government had to spend an inordinate amount of energy and diplomatic resources managing the U.S.-Canada relationship, sometimes at the expense of other international relationships. And there is every expectation in this town that a Trump-flavored Congress now will need renewed attention from Canada's politicians and diplomats. Donna?
Okay, David Akin in Ottawa, thanks. Reproductive rights and access to abortion is an issue in these midterms, but at least according to the polls, it's not the top of mind issue it was back in June. That's when the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the landmark ruling Roe versus Wade. That decision angered millions of Americans. The Democrats hope to capitalize on that anger, but it's now November, and public opinion polls show the economy and inflation have eclipsed abortion as the top issue. Farah Nasser is in Toronto. She has more on that and the rest of the day's news. Farah.
Thanks, Donna. I was recently in the U.S., and medical providers I met there are hoping the pollsters have missed out on the millions of American women motivated to vote on this single issue. Abortion has always been a hot election topic, even here in Canada. But this is the first election in post-Roe America, and abortion advocates are confident that the raw anger from this summer hasn't fizzled out. First, let's have a look at how the U.S. has changed after Roe versus Wade was overturned. Immediately following the Supreme Court's decision, abortion bans in Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Missouri, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Utah, and Wisconsin went into effect. Anyone seeking, performing, or helping with access to abortion now faces severe consequences.
My body, my choice!
The reversal led to mass protests across the country and has been used as campaign strategy by both Democrats and Republicans to win over voters in this year's midterm elections.
If Republicans get their way with a national ban, it won't matter where you live in America.
There should not be involvement from the federal government in how states decide their abortion decisions.
That a patient's room is too narrow and small and cramped a space for a woman, her doctor, and the United States government.
Tonight we want to take you to the state of Illinois, an abortion access island, mostly surrounded by states where abortion is illegal or severely restricted. Doctors from those bordering areas are now taking drastic measures and finding creative ways to protect women's reproductive rights.
When we fight, we will win.
The nurses and doctors of Wisconsin fighting to provide a service they can no longer perform.
To sit in an exam room with a patient who needs something that I can't get for her is infuriating.
Dr. Kristen Lyerly now works mostly in advocacy after a Wisconsin ban on abortion dating back to 1849 came back into effect after Roe v. Wade was overturned. Dr. Doug Lobb is the former president of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. He has spent half a century fighting for women's rights.
And he's my mentor.
Dr. Lobb is moving his Wisconsin abortion practice over the state border to neighboring Rockford, Illinois, where abortion is legal.
He goes down to Rockford with me all the time.
Jeannie Bissell is in charge of fundraising and will help Lobb run the clinic, located in a former veterinary clinic. The two take us on a trip.
How long does it take to get there? An hour and 15.
To the new site.
Yeah, it's all on the interstate, so it's not too bad.
For them, but they know the trip will be difficult for many patients.
I will do whatever it takes. If I have to hire an ambulance to get somebody from one of the hospitals down there, if their insurance won't pay for it, I'm going to pay for it because it's unconscionable.
When the Dobbs decision came down, what was that like for you?
The patients that were waiting in the waiting room had to be canceled. They had already driven the 2 or 3 hours to our clinic and to the one in Milwaukee, and then had to be canceled.
It was a very joyful day for the pro-life movement, but also a wake-up call because now our true work begins.
When door knocking in support of Republican candidates for the midterms, Gracie Stogman doesn't identify herself as part of the anti-abortion movement.
We actually aren't specifically talking about pro-life issues when we're talking to voters because it's so controversial. I mean, if they ask, I'll say this candidate's pro-life, but normally it doesn't come up.
Back on the road to Rockford, the conversation turns to politics and the importance of keeping Democratic Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers in office.
He has vetoed between 35 and 40 laws that were designed by the Republicans to inhibit access to abortion. We need to keep him in office. We need to keep our Attorney General in office.
So this is it.
Here we are.
They'll get buzzed in, and this is a security vestibule. Then they'll get buzzed in again with the receptionist.
This is what democracy looks like.
The fight for reproductive rights is also being fought along Illinois' southern border with Missouri in a more mobile way.
It looks very much like a regular brick-and-mortar health center for us.
This clinic will be accessible to those coming from out of state. The plan is to provide medical abortions by pill by the end of the year and surgical procedures next year.
We need folks to be thinking differently, to be working together, to be acting boldly, and to be taking risks.
The clinic also comes with a security guard. And back in Rockford, they're also taking precautions.
And you've already had protesters come here.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they had to call the police. Not even open yet.
Because no matter where these clinics move, those running them will have to take extra measures to give women basic medical care they've come to expect for 50 years, and many hope will return. Coming up, Putin's wartime winter strategy as colder weather nears. If Republicans in the U.S. take control of the House of Representatives and the Senate, there are fears aid being delivered to Ukraine could dry up. And that couldn't come at a worse time for the many Ukrainians still at risk from Vladimir Putin's invasion. Right now, Russian attacks are targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, knocking out power grids, and that's leaving millions of people helpless without heat. As freezing winter fast approaches, Ross Lord has more on the desperate situation.
In the eastern Ukraine town of Siversk, collecting firewood is becoming a matter of life and death for retiree Valentina Kozakova.
Очень плохо.
It's a terrible situation, she says. How could it be anything but terrible? Her apartment building is destroyed. She and her husband have lived in the basement since July with no power, no water, and no gas.
Много.
There's a lot of shelling noises, she says. Every time her heart freezes and she waits. continual mortar fire, and widespread devastation. And with Russian attacks disabling ever more power grids and water infrastructure, energy providers are using planned power cuts to avoid overloads and allow repairs. Leaders in regions enduring power blackouts, including Kyiv, are warning residents to prepare for the worst with the onset of winter later this month. Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko says in the event of a total blackout, residents should consider moving to emergency lodging with friends and family who live elsewhere and have control of their water and heating supply. The Russian effort to break the will of Ukrainians by depriving them of life's essentials is an age-old tactic used in many previous conflicts, a development that's causing military analysts to reevaluate the Russian invasion.
Yes, this could lead to cities going dark in Ukraine, where we can send generators, we can allow Ukraine to take back more territory. This will send a message to the Russian military that their situation is not encouraging, that Russia ultimately will lose this conflict.
Brown calls the Russian tactic energy terrorism. He says Canada and other allies need to step up supplies and support to Ukraine to ensure Vladimir Putin fails. Ross Lord, Global News.
Ahead, the UN Climate Summit, COP27, opens with a stark warning. A new study from the United Nations shows the last 8 years were the hottest on record. The report by the UN's World Meteorological Organization also states the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius limit for global heating is now barely within reach. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls the report a chronicle of climate chaos and that change is happening with catastrophic speed. It also comes as world leaders and delegates gather for the COP27 Climate Summit in Egypt, as many major countries are still falling short on their climate goals. In Tanzania, at least 19 people are dead after a commercial flight crashed into Lake Victoria near the city of Bukoba. The plane, operated by Precision Air, plunged into the water. It was approaching the airport. Bystanders and fishermen watched it unfold and tried to get to the scene to help. Officials believe all bodies have been recovered from the aircraft, with 26 people being treated for injuries at nearby hospitals. No details on the cause of the crash. Next, we'll rejoin Donna in Washington, why the Democrats say the future of American democracy is on the ballot.
Welcome back to Global National. We are in Washington ahead of this week's midterm elections. In the last 2 decades, democracy has been on increasingly shaky ground. In Russia, Turkey, Venezuela, India, Hungary, and Poland, leaders to varying degrees have sought to subvert institutions and the rule of law, silence critics, and consolidate their own rule. Democracy is even under threat in the place where it was thought to be well established, here in the United States. The promise of a golden future and that only one man, and it always seems to be a man, can deliver it is an appealing notion at a time when growing inequality has fueled uncertainty and anger, and elected leaders have largely failed to address it. Add to that the spread of lies about voter fraud and a stolen election, and you get a potent mix infecting this country. The Lincoln Memorial, 100 years old this year, stands as an imposing tribute to an assassinated president, the man who saved the Union immortalized in marble, a symbol of unity, strength, and wisdom. What would he make of America today?
There's no such thing as election denying in a free society. It's called free speech. You're allowed to say it if you think it, period.
And they are saying it. Republican Kari Lake is running to be Arizona governor.
The truth is that Joe Biden did not win with 81 million votes. And if you believe he did, then you are the conspiracy theorist.
The truth is, Biden did win, and all 50 states, including the Republican ones, certified the 2020 election. But it's 2022. Not only is the notion of objective truth shredded, democracy itself seems to be in peril. Listen to this conservative talk show host.
Democracy is a bad idea.
And so it has come to this: a former president campaigning to save democracy.
Truth and facts and logic and reason and basic decency are on the ballot. Democracy itself is on the ballot.
A poll conducted in October by Associated Press and the University of Chicago found only 9% of adults believe democracy is working extremely or very well. 52% feel it's not working well.
We're facing a defining moment, an inflection point. We know democracy is at risk. But we also know this: it's within our power, each and every one of us, to preserve our democracy.
Freedom House, which monitors democracy and rule of law globally, found 2021 was the 16th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. And now this man is positioning himself for a comeback, promising only he can save America.
Look at all of them. They must think I'm going to announce for president, and that's a lot.
Democracy, though, depends on the power of the people, not on one man, and not on lies, violence, and attempted insurrection. The attack on the U.S. Capitol failed in 2021. The ideals this country was built on prevailed, as the great memorials remind us, even if they stand on increasingly shaky ground. And that is Global National for this Sunday from the American capital, Washington, D.C. I'll see you back here tomorrow. For Farah Nasser and myself, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.